But this second nature can become an object to itself. It can become an object to itself only because we also now become not merely substances in having this second nature, we also become subjects. That is, we occupy a position in social space. Now, to be a subject, as opposed to merely being a substance, is to be able not merely to have a second nature and have it as an object of itself, but also to be able to make normative judgments. To be able to say that something is correct or incorrect, appropriate or inappropriate, true or false, right or wrong, moral, immoral, ethical, unethical. Okay, all these involve this element of ought with it. By virtue of assuming a position in social space, we now acquire a whole bunch of inferential moves we can make. Now, by an inferential move, I mean something like the following. Well, many inferential moves are quite obvious. For example, if something is red, then I know that it's not green, because to be red is to be exclusive of green and vice versa. But I also learn a number of other inferences, such as, you have no right to talk to me like that. Or, well, but this is the way I am supposed to respond to people like you. Or, what gave you the authority to tell me what to do here? All these are inferences. That is, you have a spot, and you now know what inferences you may validly make to other kinds of things. It's the kind of question, one of the first questions that small children ask their parents. So why do I have to do what you tell me to do here? And of course, because I'm your mom, I'm your dad, and I get to tell you. Oh, yeah, right. Thank you for pointing that out. Here. But this making of inferences in social space gives us this reflective detachment now from things. That is, we acquire not merely a second nature, but a capacity to evaluate that second nature according to social norms. Appropriate, inappropriate, correct, incorrect, right, wrong, true, false. Here. And by virtue of being able to evaluate our second nature, and by having our second nature be an object of itself, we now are able to reshape that second nature. Now, the second nature, by the way, when we begin to think about it, is not merely our own habits and dispositions, but also the entire social world around us. The various institutions and practices that encourage certain types of actions, promote certain types of habits, right? Discourage other kinds of habits, etc. So in changing our second nature, often we don't merely work on ourselves, we also work collectively on the institutions that we have in the world. One of the reasons for banning the practice of dueling here is that, like this, libertarians, people who really believe that the state should not regulate anything, often like to characterize dueling as allowing adults to shoot at each other with live ammunition for sport. Here. And they say, why should people be prohibited from doing that? And the answer really is because given human nature, there would be a lot of us who would end up accepting duels, although it's better that nobody be allowed to do so at all. So we know in advance that this is an institution that will in fact encourage destructive behavior. If we ban the institution, make it socially unacceptable, frown on people who do so, then eventually this practice will die out, and people will find other destructive things to do. Yeah. Now, because of this kind of social nature, we can reshape our second nature, though it's very hard to do. It is, after all, nature. Nature doesn't move very easily according to our wishes or whims and so on. It's hard to change ourselves. And what we have to do is develop new reflective practices. Now, here are two conditions Hegel thinks have to be met. Sorry, because I'm an Apple user, and this is a PC here. So, this is one of these great contradictions of the modern world here. What causes an agent to act? Hegel thinks that there's always a cause of your action. What causes you to act is your nature, your second nature. If I ask, why'd you do this? It's because of what you are. When what causes you to act makes sense to you. Now, this is a weasel word here. I'm leaving this purposely vague at the moment. When that makes sense to you, you are, as Hegel puts it, at one with yourself. So you're doing this. So you might be, say, sweeping up the floor after dinner, let's say. And I say, why are you sweeping the floor? I say, always sweep the floor. Why? Because he's sweeping. Why would you be doing this? Well, because it seems, I'm not hurting any about this. You are at one with yourself. You don't feel that there's anything at all odd or inappropriate or normatively wrong about what you're doing. Now, when you can have a reflective capacity to understand what you're doing and to give it as a reason, you're not merely at one with yourself. Hegel's term for this in German is bei sich sein. You're not merely at one with yourself. You are free. And I would put this down as saying when you are the cause of your own cause. Here's a sidelight, right? There's a long debate in the free will literature about whether or not we are free or determined, or whether or not the two are compatible or incompatible. And Kant saw, very quickly, right? Most of you know this. Kant saw that it seemed to be the case if that were the only two alternatives, freedom or determinism, then the only way we could be free would be if we were somehow standing above the causal order and giving orders down to the entire causal order, so that we initiated causal events that were not themselves the product, where this initiation was not itself another causal event. There's these odd events that just happen out of time, of course, and they just intervene directly in the causal order and shape things. This is the only way out of this concept. And Hegel, again, at the end of book 2 of his Science of Logic, more or less said, well, actually, here's the third alternative, which is what's called reciprocal causation. So there, that is, we are an intricate, self-reflective, self-monitoring system that is operating on itself. And we are the cause of our own causes when our second nature, our character that is operating on us, is a character that makes sense to us, for which we can give reflectively good reasons. On this, Hegel agreed with Aristotle, your character is your destiny. But you, of course, can change your character. And to a limited extent, you can therefore change your destiny. This is a denial of a radical Augustinian view. It is an affirmation of a more ancient Aristotelian view about the relation between freedom and destiny. Now, if that's true here, and it looks as if this so-called idealist proposal, which emphasizes that substance should become subject, and therefore ultimately the explanatory priority of all this normative stuff, in fact has got a very good understanding of the material basis of action. That if the charge is Hegel's an idealist, he only thinks the only thing that's real are thoughts, whereas I'm Marx, I'm a materialist, a naturalist, I think the only thing that's real are material events. And this just shows that Marx actually hasn't understood Hegel, and probably didn't understand his Aristotle as well as he thought he did. Okay, now, what is the whole within which we orient ourselves? Now, what is the whole? What is this if it's not going to be nature here? If it's not going to be nature, it's going to have to be something else. And, of course, one of the things that Marx proposed is that it had to be history. History forms a large whole. History forms a whole which now has a kind of internal drive to itself. It is aiming for a certain conclusion. And if we learn to orient ourselves within that, it's as if, once again in the darkness, we can grab onto this, right? Find the wall, go along the wall, because we know this is the way out, find the door, open the door, and then of course we step into life here. Now, this is often said to be the role that Hegel, in fact, right, ascribed to history. Now, of course, by now you can fairly well guess where this argument is going. But one of the things that's quite clear about history for Hegel is that history, like nature, is not aiming at anything. This does not mean that history has no purpose. History, there was never anything in history, say, called the world spirit, which had a goal. It was headed for that goal, and sometime around 1789, in the French Revolution, it realized it. It took a few more years for it to understand what it had done, 1807, after Hegel wrote his Phenomenology. But then history had succeeded and kind of, congratulated itself, and everything's been fine since then. This, of course, isn't Hegel's view. Look, There never was on this view. There couldn't have been a large subject, right, guiding history. It was aiming at anything. It was rather a series of human forms of life, which broke down for reasons that at the time those people could not understand themselves. There was a series of successors to those forms of life that first consisted of the people who just found themselves in this chaotic situation where the old rules had broken down and weren't sure where. They knew that they had to go somewhere, and they started going in this direction. And then finally, after the French Revolution and the proclamation of the rights of man, according to Hegel, we now have a way of philosophically comprehending what meaning that history may have had. And of course the meaning is that when we look back now at empirical history, now Hegel is making both a philosophical and an empirical claim. He is claiming that when we look at the history of the world, we will see that among all the other changes that have gone on, there's huge amounts of changes in technology, eating, culture, everything else. There's at least a large philosophical question that has always been raised, which is the one that Aristotle raises in the Nicomachean Ethics and in the Politics. And it's the question of who has the right to rule. Plato raises this in the Republic also, obviously. Not who does rule. That's an empirical political science question. Who has the right to rule? Who has the right to create the law that other people must follow? And Hegel says there really, as it turns out, when we look at history, it turns out there were three and only three alternatives. Either one person, say the emperor, the pharaoh, one person has a right to set the law, and everybody else must follow it. Or a group of people, some, set the law, aristocrats, let's say, male aristocrats, set the law, and other people follow it. Or all of us set the law, and we all equally contribute to following. Now, this is Hegel's famous shorthand he would give his students. He would say history has a progression. One is free, some are free, all are free. Here, right? Those are the only three possibilities. One, some, all. The empirical study of history, he says, actually shows us that something like this is the case, and this begins to give us now an answer to Kant's question. Kant asked, who could be the author of the moral law for oneself? Who could tell you the right and wrong thing to do except for you yourself? You must therefore be a self-authorizing being. But there are no self-authorizing beings. First of all, it's a logical contradiction because even as Kant himself came to see, if the only way you can be subject to a law is to impose it on yourself, then you have to ask whether it's rational for you to have imposed that law on yourself. And you can't appeal to that law and to show it, so you need another law ad infinitum here. So there can be nothing like this. Kant, in his critique of practical reason, realizing that this was a paradox, said this is just the fact of reason. Faktum der Vernunft. We can't get around it. We just find ourselves both under the law and as setting the law. But Kant used the same phrase that he shared, actually, he took from Rousseau. He said, in the true moral world, we'd have a kingdom of ends where each would be both sovereign and subject. In the ideal world, each of us would be in a situation where I give you all the rules. I tell this group what to do. But at the same time, every single member of this group is telling me what to do. Now, there's a back and forth, a kind of give and take about this, and what Hegel thinks happened in the French Revolution was something of monumental importance that had first been announced by this, insignificant man, carpenter from Nazareth, Jesus, a couple of thousand years beforehand. Jesus had said, everyone is equal in the eyes of God. The rights of man said, that's true, and actually we can make everyone equal. Not in the sense that everyone will have equal powers, or that there will be no differences of wealth, but that every person is now entitled to an equal dignity, an equal treatment of decency, that we are all now cooperating in this kind of way of thinking about things. So history has a purpose in the sense that we can understand now that, not that history was aiming at anything, but that given that we have ended up in this case, and now if we make the arguments, tricky enough, we can understand why we are suddenly in a position to evaluate this for what it is, and to understand this as now having been rationally required by us, so that really we are in the situation that although we are far from achieving it practically, we are at the situation where we now know that the Declaration of Human Rights is in fact, the rights of man, is in fact the truth about us. That there is no person who by birth, nature, has the right to rule automatically over other people. Here. Now, he calls this by the German term Aufhebung. Here. German term Aufhebung. Often translated in English as sublation because there is no English word for Aufhebung. So the translators, well, basically they made a word up. They found a word in English that hasn't been used since about 1500. And they said, close enough. Right. When Hegel talks about Aufhebung, by the way, when you read almost all literature on Hegel, it says that the word means three things, right, in German. Right? Aufhebung means both to negate something, cancel it out, as if say your life insurance policy is canceled, it is aufgehoben. You know. It means to preserve something, as you might say, would you save a place for me at the concert? Would you aufheben a place for me? And of course, it also means, you know, for those of you who know German, right, to lift up, eben auf. So you'll see in the Hegel literature, it always says, Hegel uses this term in three senses: to cancel, preserve, and to raise up. And this is given, you might say, a lot of ammunition, not a lot of ammunition. It's given a lot of support to everyone who wants to say that really the Hegelian system is an idealist system, as Marx said it was. You have these things at the bottom, and then they get aufgehoben, sublated, you know, and say swallowed in something larger, and then swallowed in something larger, and then larger, and higher, and raised up until finally you reach absolute spirit, and everything's contained in it. And this is a very dangerous view of totality. It is the spirit of totality that informed Marx. It is probably the most dangerous, although maybe logically consequential, arguments in all of modern philosophy. In the two places where Hegel discusses his use of Aufhebung, in the Science of Logic and in the Encyclopedia of Philosophical Sciences, he says explicitly, I meant to put this in as a quote in my presentation here, but I somehow wrote that. Explicitly, Aufhebung, he says, only has two meanings: negate and preserve. Forget about the raising up. Never mentions this. Never, doesn't mention it very much. Never mentions it. It is not a raising up. It is, in fact, a canceling and a preserving. Here's a metaphorical way to think. Instead of thinking of this process as going upwards, think of it as going from side to side, horizontally rather than vertically. That's a metaphor. But nonetheless, to aufheben something is to circumscribe its authority. Something is aufgehoben, sublated in Hegel, when the authority it has over you or it has over someone else is canceled, circumscribed, limited, by moving to a new context here, where you're not exactly denying the old thing, but you're now limiting it in a certain way, so you're both canceling it and preserving it. So, for example, Hegel says I have a right to private property, but this gets aufgehoben in morality. It's not that I lose all my property in morality, it's that, no, it turns out I can't do anything with it I want to, particularly if it leads, to violent harming of another person and so on. So it's preserved, canceled, but preserved at the same time. In fact, it's a wonderful metaphor here. Now, what history has shown us, from one is free to some are free or all are free, is really a process of vast changes in social authority. This is what philosophically we learn from history. There are many other things to learn from history. This is the philosophical lesson here. And that the great mistake, of course, is to think, as Hegel thinks, to think that we should conclude, therefore, too much from this. Why? Well, part of this has to do with this use of Aufhebung as a way of handling philosophical problems. Let's go back to orientation in the dark. Kant thinks, remember, when we find ourselves in complete darkness, we look for landmarks. When we leave the realm of ordinary experience and we ask ourselves, what is the world like as a whole? Ask the classical questions of metaphysics and of life. Right? What is my place in the larger order of things? What happens is that when we detach ourselves from experience like this, we quickly find ourselves engaged in various antinomies, as Kant called it. That is, basic contradictions. Freedom versus determinism. Does the world have a beginning in time? Does it have no ending in time? Is the world infinitely divisible? Or is it only divisible down to certain parts? Right? That we find these really basic contradictions. And Hegel Kant called this, dialectic. Hegel called it the same thing. What we learn in dialectic is that we don't abolish these contradictions. We tame the threat to reason that they seem to hold by putting them into their proper context. And in particular, Hegel thought that in the modern world, we find that there are, basically for us to be the kinds of modern people that we have come to be, or in general, to have become the kind of individuals that we have become over the long process of world history. To become individuals, self-originating sources of claims, we're going to have to presuppose that there are certain rights that we have vis-a-vis each other, life, liberty, and the pursuit of property, pursuit of happiness, life, liberty, and property, or life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That there will be various philosophical contradictions in those rights. Locke says those rights are all relative to the act of a sovereign. Hobbes says those are all relative to the act of a sovereign. Locke says they are all natural and precede in the act of sovereignty. Back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. We will subscribe to the doctrine of rights, even though these philosophical answers will not be ultimately answered. These philosophical problems will not be ultimately answerable. Likewise, for us to have these rights, we will require a certain moral conception of ourselves as able to act impartially. There'll be problems with that. Doubting problems versus consequential problems. For us to be these moral individuals who also ascribe to having these rights is for us to be now committed to very particularistic types of claims in family, civil society, and the constitutional state. But as Hegel says over and over again to his students in his lectures, there is no final solution to be found to these problems in any state at all that is possible in human history. Every state itself is limited, finite. It's merely one state among many. It cannot provide a basis for the ultimate satisfaction in life. You will not get your orientation completely by your membership in any state at any time, anywhere. In fact, the great philosophical temptation from the Greeks up to the present has been the idea that there might be a final overarching whole within which we could orient ourselves in life. This is the danger, Hegel thinks, in this. The only time we ever saw a picture of that, he said, was in ancient Greece. The Greeks thought the world was a purposive organic whole. They thought that in their society that if everyone simply followed out their social position in life and did their own duty, that this would spontaneously organize itself, spontaneously harmonize with itself. What the Greeks found, tragically, this was what their tragedies were really about, was that that wasn't possible. That this dream of a spontaneous harmony, which can occur in little things like parties and so on, that all of our social and political life could be organized around this kind of spontaneous harmony, this is possible, is what he thinks is the great animating delusion of modern times. And in fact, his philosophy is intended to be a kind of inoculation against these kinds of things. Here. Now, there's just no, if there is no self-restoring, self-harmonizing organic unity in nature, and no self-harmonizing organic unity in history, and no self-harmonizing organic unity in social and political life, then there's no law guiding that can be orientating for us. There's lots of orientations we can find, but as Hegel says in his 1820 Philosophy of Right in the preface, he says, philosophy always arrives too late on the scene to give the world any instruction on where to go. The owl of Minerva only spreads its wings and flies when the sun is going down, flies at dusk. Here. We can be oriented, but ultimately the kind of totality that philosophy gives us, which is a totality in thought, as we stand back now and we ask ourselves, how do we justify all these things? What sense does all of this make? And how do we put all this together into a coherent philosophical system that we can achieve a kind of wholeness and totality in thought, but never in practice? And in particular, any organic view of the state would just be a disaster. What was Hegel's alternative, by the way? Well, once again, Hegel said, everything good and rational about this has already been written by Aristotle. All we need to do is learn how to retranslate this into terms acceptable for the modern world. As Aristotle puts this here, this is the point of view of right. Individuals have the right to administer their own resources, so on. I had this up for a while. I'll come back to this in just a second here. The quote from Aristotle says, the best society is one run by a society of equals, that is, of the middle class. The worst thing that can happen to a society is that you have vast gaps in wealth. Why? Because the rich think everything is purchasable. Die Reichen denken, dass alle käuflich ist. They think they can buy their way out of anything, so they feel no social obligation. The poor have no stake in society, so they feel no social obligation. Such a society is always on the brink of falling apart. In fact, what we should aim for, he says, is the decent society. Right? A society, not a classless society, a middle-class society. Not a society where everyone has the same, but a society where there's no great gaps between the poor and the wealthy. This was, of course, the original left Hegelian alternative, taken up by Edward Gans, and then later Heinrich Heine. Edward Gans was Marx's teacher. Apparently Marx didn't listen to that part of the lecture very, very well. So there are, of course, problems with this world. We could go into them. Hegel thinks that first there's a problem. The world might become too prosaic. There is this point of view of right that individuals should have the right to administer their own resources and so on. This is the democratic principle that you should share in the government of local communities, corporations, and guilds. One of the greatest ills that can befall a state, and it's a class of officials, the bureaucrats. They become remote and alien. This is Hegel speaking. And by its skills in education and use of official authority may provide a channel for the arbitrary will and the oppression of its citizenry. There's a danger at stake now in this new, modern, rational, bureaucratic state, which ought to be this kind of middle-class state, right, with no great gaps in wealth. And he says, in fact, the kind of jargon that bureaucratic officials, he's thinking particularly of Prussian officials here, says citizens learn to regard their, quote, bureaucratic language as a kind of underworld jargon, like some kind of thieves' slang. Sounds familiar? If, in fact, the state were to go so far as actually to require identity papers from everyone and require their picture, such that you would have to produce your identity papers to the police upon request, Hegel tells his students, right, the state would then truly become a vessel of galley slaves, where everyone is supposed to always be exercising oversight over everybody else. And there is a danger, he thinks, in our modern, over-administered world here, that this could become a reality. So it's not all rosy and so on with Hegel here. But basically the argument is, should Marx have been a Hegelian? If Marx had learned the lesson about organic totality and not thought that idealism simply was the substitution of thought for reality, but had taken some of these other ideas seriously, I think Marx would have realized he should have been a Hegelian. In fact, it was this myth of spontaneous harmony, the great idealized view that this was the golden age of ancient Greece, and that we just get that restored again here. Something impossible within this modern world of individuals, the dream of somehow now not sublating these oppositions, not the Aufhebung of them, but the overcoming of them here would be, of course, the dream. And we will never overcome all these contradictions. Most pragmatically speaking, the most we can learn to do is balance them. We should never confuse politics with metaphysics. We should never think, on the other hand, we're at the end of philosophy or the end of metaphysics. As Kant said in the very last part of the Critique of Pure Reason, after having spent 700 pages trying to demonstrate that philosophical metaphysics was an impossible enterprise and was bound to fail, it's actually rather striking. At the last 2 pages of the book, Kant says, so, shall we give up doing metaphysics? He says, no. No, we'll always come back to metaphysics like to an old lover after a quarrel, right? Knowing that we can't do without each other. Well, that's more or less, I think, what you might say the Hegelian view is. In that respect, he shares this with Kant. Should Marx have been Hegelian? Of course he should. That's Hegel at his various stages, as a 19-year-old student at Tübingen, and a 31-year-old man in Jena, and a 60-year-old man in Berlin. Thank you very much for your attention.